And welcome back to Capitol Tonight. There is no doubt at this point that more funding is needed to maintain roads and bridges upstate. If you are not convinced of that, we basically failed utterly on this show we've been talking about for so long. After Governor Cuomo announced an historic investment in New York City's MTA, there was sort of a backlash, which is growing, with groups calling for a similar investment upstate. And one of these groups we're talking about here is the Associated General Contractors of New York. Jobs is what they're concerned about, but they're not alone. Mike Elmendorf is the president of that group. He's with me now in the studio. Welcome back to Capitol Tonight.
Thank you. Good to be back.
No, seriously, if we have not convinced people of this, that roads and bridges and infrastructure and sewer funding and waterways are in desperate need of funding, that really I should quit.
Well, I think people are convinced, actually. I mean, if you look at public opinion polls, a year or so ago, we did a poll. And we looked to see where this issue was sort of on the radar with the public at large. And it was there, which was good, but it was like number 11.
Right.
And then several months later, Siena did a poll, because we only had the money to spend on one poll. Siena did a poll, and they asked a very similar question. And infrastructure had leapfrogged up into the top 5 or 6 issues. When there was a poll done after the governor's announcement on the MTA, which is a good thing, I think we talked about that last time I was here. We support the MTA investment, but it's created this push for parity on the highway side, which I'm sure we'll talk more about. But there was a poll that showed about 70% of New Yorkers supported equitable investment between both the DOT and the MTA. So I think people get it, and it's hard not to get it, especially when you talk about roads and bridges. The environmental infrastructure is a little more nuanced because you don't see it. It's underground, right? But when you're driving around...
Until it floods, until a sewer floods into your waterway.
Sewer main breaks, the road collapses, your water's brown, you can't drink it, the toilet doesn't work, those things happen. But roads and bridges, you see this problem. You're driving around, you're dodging potholes, you're on bridges where you kind of hold your breath and hope for the best until you get to the other side. You can see the deterioration of that infrastructure, but across the board, it's all in pretty rough shape.
Before we get into the whole discussion about parity, I do want to ask, this is sort of a godsend what's happening right now in terms of all the weather that we've had, because it's held off on the freeze and thaw cycle.
Absolutely.
That it does such a number on the roads and has enabled a lot of these local governments that have been able to hoard their money, really, that they blew through last year because of such a difficult winter.
They're saving money on salt, and actually we still have a lot of our folks that are out doing work because you ordinarily are shut down at this point. You can't pave now because the average temperatures are too low. But if you look around, there's still work happening, and ordinarily you don't see that now. So that's
so
good
I was going to
news.
ask if it was impacting you guys as well in a positive way. It is.
It is, but we expect that we'll pay for it later in the winter. I don't know anybody is getting out their Bermuda shorts just yet.
Not just yet, although I've seen people wearing shorts, which is really quite something. So the thing is here, in terms of parity, and we've had this discussion, but I just want to reiterate it. Are you looking for dollar parity? Because that's $8.3 billion.
That's parity, actually.
Where's it going to come from? I'm not even really clear where the MTA...
I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay.
I think maybe we'll know the answer to that question on January 13th when the governor presents his budget and state of the state together. But parity is it's not a term that we've created in this context. It's a sort of a defined term, right? It's the state of being equal. And that's what the two programs were, just about dollar for dollar up until 2009, 2010, when there were different political dynamics. It's not really an upstate, downstate issue because there are roads and bridges in New York City and on Long Island, and about 40% of the people who use the MTA by getting to MTA services in a car, right? You see the parking lots, they're pretty full.
Right.
So you can't really say it's an upstate, downstate issue, but this was parity, right? Parity was basically being equal. And since parity was broken in 2009, 2010, the MTA has outpaced the DOT program in capital investment by like $6 billion.
Okay, we'll stop right there. So parity technically actually would be this. In order to get us back to this, you would have to make up for...
You could make that argument.
I
think what we're talking about, to be reasonable here, is that I think if you take where the MTA was and you add in over the 5 years the commitment that the governor has made, which again is a good thing, it puts them at about $26 billion a year in capital investment. That's what DOT should be getting. And if anybody asks the question, well, do they need that money? Could they spend that money? The answer is not only do they need that money, they actually need more money than that, because the last time they had a public needs assessment out there, I think their needs were at about $28 billion. So as crazy as that is, even if they got all that money, it's true for the MTA, by the way, too, they're not going to be able to do everything that they need to do with that investment, but it's going to make their system a whole lot better.
They also have a hole that they say they're going to be able to fill not through fare hikes, but actually by economies, which I'm not exactly certain what that means.
Well, we'll see more about that. And one of the other things I think it's worth mentioning on the MTA agreement, which should happen for DOT, is that there is a policy change in what the governor's outlined that funds that the MTA has that are for capital purposes won't be able to be used for non-capital purposes. DOT needs the same protection because we've talked before about the dedicated fund or the not so dedicated fund.
Right.
You have a lot of non-capital expenses that have been tacked on there by legislatures past who wanted to pay for stuff that they didn't have money for, so they raided basically the dedicated fund. We need to get that same sort of protection here.
Well, what we're doing here is sort of reiterating and recapping a lot of conversations that you and I and others have had in the past. And just to remind everyone also, I mean, it would be nice if we had a 5-year plan, which we do not.
We haven't had one since right after the last Bond Act. Now, there's been a big change, though, since the last time we were here talking about this, which is that Congress finally passed a long-term highway bill. And we joked before about the next time I was on to talk about the next extension, just use the same segment. We could go do something else. But they actually got their job done in a very good bipartisan way. It was actually how government was supposed to work. They passed a 5-year bill.
Yep.
It's not as much money as some people would like, but it's an increase. It's an increase to New York of about $1.57 billion over the 5-year period. About $800 million of that will go to roads and bridges. The rest goes to other surface transportation modes like rail and transit. But that's a good thing, and when you'd have conversations with people in Albany about we need a 5-year fully funded DOT capital program, they would agree, yes, but we can't really plan without Washington doing their part. And that was a fair statement. I also didn't believe that it meant that you shouldn't do anything. If you were waiting on Washington, you might be waiting a long time, and we waited 10 years and 36 extensions, right? But they've now done that, and so we have certainty from Washington as to what the federal program looks like. It's Albany's turn to step up and do their part.
So just before we run out of time, are you getting any inklings from the second floor, that would be the governor's office, of course, as to whether or not he's hearing this and he's planning on saying something?
I think so. I mean, look, the Senate is solid. Senator Flanagan publicly has been out there on this.
Yes, well, because they're an upstate-driven entity, but go ahead.
The Speaker's been out there on this because he's hearing about it from his upstate members who are participating in events with us around the state, and the governor has acknowledged that they need to address the needs of DOT. You know, we'll see if everybody agrees on what parity is, right? But I think you're going to see progress, hopefully, in the executive budget. Hopefully we see parity. You've got a huge coalition. It's not just the construction industry.
No, I know.
It's the whole of the business community, labor, the environmental community, all the municipal groups. Everybody agrees that this is important, including people who don't usually agree with each other, which should get people's attention.
We've had them on tonight as well. But I'll just say this in closing. We may come to a moment where we redefine parity.
Well, we'll see, because historically, if the Capital Plan Review Board gets an MTA plan that doesn't have parity and a multi-year program for DOT, the Senate has every time vetoed it. So there's some very real political dynamics here, too, that I think have to be addressed, because the Senate is there looking to make sure that there's balance. And I don't have any reason to think that if that's what happens, they won't do what they've always done in the past, which forces everybody back to the table to figure it out.
Well, we will see. I thank you so much. Oh, and have a lovely holiday season.
Likewise. Same to you.
Thanks.